gets a copy of that. Okay. So I have a swale project that I was going to share a little bit of. See if I can share my screen. So I was just going to share, I'm going to try and make this as brief as I can because we're running a little bit over, but I wanted to share a little bit about swales and a project that I completed during the fall of 2020 that almost anyone can replicate for issues relating to erosion control, drought, or flooding. In this slide is a sketch of a swale, which is a simple ditch or trench dug on contour, which means that it's dug horizontally or level to the ground rather than, say, running perpendicular up and down a slope. A swale can be anywhere from a few inches to a few feet deep, and its purpose is to capture rainwater and in so doing to slow or pause the speed at which the water would otherwise run off the land. Instead, it will sink into the ground where it is naturally filtered, preventing erosion and flooding, and thereby the silting of streams and waterways. It will also water surrounding vegetation longer into the dry season and recharge groundwater. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the concept of swales, I'll show you just a few examples of some of the ways they can be used. The left-hand photo shows a swale being used as a plant bed to catch runoff from an impervious surface, in this case a parking lot. The right-hand photo shows a rock path with a swale dug underneath to catch water that will supply moisture to the plant beds on either side. So you wouldn't even know in this particular one that there's a swale underneath when walking on it. And here's another pathway that was dug out and then filled with wood chips in order to provide moisture to the plant beds on either side. Woody material is great to use as fill in a swale because when it rains, the wood swells with that moisture. And then as it dries, it shrinks as it releases water back into the soil, keeping it hydrated longer into the year and reducing the need for supplemental watering. And here's a swale used to capture water for a rain garden. And here are a series of swales filled with wood chips that I dug alongside 3 hedgerows in a side pasture that we use for an orchard and native edibles. It might be a little hard to tell in this photo, but the land slopes downward from the left side of the picture to the right. And when it rains, the swales catch the water and sink it farther into the soil where the trees and shrubs can make use of it. This then also prevents more runoff downslope. And so here I am with my shovel and my helper cat. And I should mention here that I was not in the habit of digging ditches. So when I began this project, I did just a little bit at a time over several weeks to give myself a chance to get over being intimidated by the idea, going at my own pace and working in short segments as time allowed. The beauty of digging a swale, though, is that it's very low tech, but highly effective. It was something I could do by myself using simple concepts. It cost me $0 and I found all needed materials on site. The only primary tool I used was a shovel, but I occasionally used a level and then briefly a wire cutter and pipe tape, which is shown in the photo on the right. I got away with beginning this project before the rains when the ground was hard because our soil is very sandy, so I was able to slice it out in small dry chunks. And so the type of soil that each of you have might determine what times of year you'd want to be doing something similar. So I live on a 6-acre small farm where we have grazed horses and more recently sheep, goats, and cattle. For my situation, the swales I've installed are part of a larger strategy to augment a broader, holistic grazing management plan that I coordinate with 3 other neighbors who have adjoining small farms. And as Elaine mentioned in her presentation, managing the grazing patterns of horses and other animals can be such an important and effective way for those of you who own or have access to land to grow quality soil and its ability to infiltrate water, sequester carbon, provide nutritious, high-quality forage that lasts longer into the growing season, and be more resilient during times of drought and flooding. At the same time, if you are living in a more urban or suburban area or have a horse facility without pasture, installing swales can be highly effective on their own. So my particular project was to capture and redirect all the water that runs off the side of our main barn roof during the rains in order to aid my broader efforts to stop water from running off the property in general. That section of roof is about 960 square feet, which means this roof sheds about 576 gallons of water with every inch of rainfall. So in a normal year of rain in my area, just this one section of roof can generate about 14,400 gallons of water per year. And I'll be sending you information on how to calculate those figures, by the way. So my plan was to continue to direct the water flowing off the roof into the downspout that you see in the right-hand photo, but that meant redirecting where that downspout took the water, which was currently running through underground pipes out to the driveway where it had been directed for the past 42 years. You can see the dark corrugated pipe at the bottom of the left-hand photo where water from the roof would gush out during the rains. And I'm including the second photo on the right, taken later at a different time of year, because I was hoping to better show the significant downslope of this property that runs to the road and how easily water could be carried off-site. Now, the grass will slow some of the flow from the drain pipe, but before our soil became more porous with improved management, that grass was not enough to keep all of that concentrated flow of water from sheeting over the surface and down into the street where it joined other runoff from neighboring properties and then picked up silt and toxins off the road before finding its way into the nearest creek, which for us is just down the street. So directly in front of the barn, you can see that there's a bed of dried out nasturtiums that died from lack of water. And so I decided to dig my swale here. One, because it was a convenient place to redirect the downspout coming off the barn roof, and because the water I captured there would water that nasturtium bed for me. I should mention that before digging, it's important to know where your existing underground pipelines are. And because I don't own this property, for me that meant involving the owner in those discussions and checking maps of water and gas lines. The second slide to the right shows the initial dig. I laid out tarps to make it easier to keep the soil in a neat pile and easier to clean up afterwards. I then disconnected the downspout from the old pipe that ran out to the driveway and attached a new length of corrugated pipe that I could direct into the swale, attaching the two using pipe wrap tape. And incidentally, I found this leftover corrugated pipe, which had been lying out behind the barn for 20 years. I also used a level to make sure that the bottom surface of this swale was level, so that when the water flowed into it, it would lie evenly throughout the entire length and not run out one side. And then at the end of the corrugated pipe, I found it and attached a length of drain pipe with holes. You can see an example of that on the top right-hand photo, to help evenly distribute the flow of water into the swale. This isn't really necessary, but since we also happen to have a small length of it lying around, I went ahead and made use of it. And then I wrapped that pipe with a fine mesh cloth to keep debris and soil particles from working their way into the holes and clogging it up, as you can see in the lower right-hand photo. And here's just a front shot giving you a complete idea of the project, how you can see how everything fits together. And some of you now might be questioning why water is being collected right alongside a building structure. So going back to this slide, there were actually several things that I did to prevent water damage and seepage inside the barn. First, you might have already noted that this is a small swale that is not anywhere large enough to hold all of the water that comes off this roof during a rainstorm. So I dug a secondary or overflow swale that I'll show you in a moment. But this was one of the ways that I prevented too much water building up around the barn itself. Secondly, you can see that the foundation of the barn to the right of the swale is set above ground, and that the swale, while not deep, is dug below that foundation. So once again, preventing water from pooling up against the siding. And then finally, as I mentioned before, I was working with sandy soil that drains relatively rapidly, so I could feel confident that there would be no standing water even at the bottom of the swale. Whereas if you're dealing with clay or adobe soil that holds a lot of moisture and tends to pool up, having a swale that close to a building is probably not the right choice for you, and in that case would mean redirecting the downspout further away. So then I filled the swale in with woody material we had on hand from tree trimmings that we had chipped into a pile. But if we don't happen to have them on hand, if I hear the sound of a chipper when the county prunes back trees and shrubs in the neighborhood, I'm often running out down the street to talk to the work crews, because many times they're happy to have a place to dump their loads. And so if you happen to live in an area where this kind of thing takes place, it can be useful to get to know your local crews. But if you don't have wood chips on hand, you can use any type of woody plant trimmings to fill a swale. You can see that in the left-hand photo, where I top those wood chips off with finer clippings from my own hand prunings. And I should mention that it's important to really pack that material in by walking back and forth on top of it to ensure that the sides of the swale don't collapse or erode. And so after filling the swale, I covered it with several inches of the same soil that I had dug out, and I topped that off with a layer of compost that I then reseeded. And on the right, you can see what that dried out bed of nasturtiums looked like the following spring. So as I mentioned, that first swale alongside the barn was not large enough to hold all the rainwater flowing off the roof. So I dug a secondary swale downslope, and here is that same swale, just different shot showing it next to the garden bed that it will be feeding. This soil happened to be very rocky, so I ended up sifting out the rocks and placing them at the bottom of the swale, which would aid in filtration and then make the remaining rock-free soil better suited for topping and reseeding, as you'll see in a moment. So that first slide to the left shows the connecting channel from the smaller swale to the larger one. And the second slide shows the formula that I roughly followed to make sure that the overflow from the first swale would run seamlessly through the channel and into the second swale. The picture on the right is showing that the first swale is level, and before the water fills up to the top, it will flow down a 4-inch drop indicated at the bottom. And it's important to make that drop into a subsequent channel at least 4 inches to ensure that the water does not backflow over the sides of the initial swale. So now obviously the connecting channel on the left needs to be at a downslope from the top swale in order for the water to flow into the overflow swale. I was not exact about the degree of slope in the connecting channel, and for a project like this you really don't need to be, but it's ideal to have a gradual slope that keeps the water flowing but not gushing. And I used the level you see lying in the middle of the connector channel just to make sure that I was digging in a continuous downslope. Here is the connector channel in second swales filled with wood chips. And here is what it looks like when the project was completed. And after it had been covered with the soil and reseeded. And then this is just a shot from the front showing the barn and this initial swale on the left side of the photo, and the overflow swale on the right of the photo, but to the upside of the garden bed to the right. And so in conclusion, as I mentioned in the beginning, the purpose of this project was to augment what the land itself was already becoming capable of doing because of implementing better grazing practices over the previous several years. And this was the first rainy season that our land has been able to infiltrate all of the rainwater that fell onto the property, which meant that we had no runoff for the first time since the current owners purchased this land over 40 years ago. So what that actually means is that after 20 or more inches of rain that we've had so far this year, we've been able to sink well over 3 million gallons of rainwater on our 6 acres, which is the equivalent of about 1,600 2,000 gallon water cisterns. And this photo just gives you an idea of how many that is. That was a great relief after watching some of our neighbors truck in water because their wells had gone dry. And then this last photo shows how dry our property looks like in late summer, early fall. My town of Petaluma is a high-risk fire area, while parts of it are also a flood zone. And the point that I really want to stress is that even in arid places, more rainwater falls than we actually use. And yet everywhere we are depleting our rivers and lakes and underground aquifers that supply us with fresh water. And or we are experiencing more flooding because we have managed our lands in such a way as to limit its capacity to infiltrate adequate rainwater. So I'm hoping that this leaves you all with some good food for thought. And with that, I will conclude the share. Oh, there you are, Elaine.
Yeah, it let me